In this video, we're going to go ahead and configure ESLint to work with our Babel compiler so that we can properly validate our code and our coding conventions and catch common errors both in our future WebPack configuration, our Gulp file, and within Visual Studio Code itself. So ESLint, I've mentioned this before, ESLint basically goes in and tells you if you're doing anything stupid, and it'll help you make your code better, as you will see. And what I'm going to do first is, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hop over into source server, and I'm going to show this code. This code is not yet valid. Well, this is not valid JavaScript simply because we are using the object res spread, which isn't part of the JavaScript specification yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and install a local version of ESLint. So when we lint our code, it's very important in a project setting that we install a local copy of it. And that's so we can lock down the particular version of ESLint that we're working with our projects, because certain projects might use different versions of ESLint, and installing it globally is generally not a good thing. I do, however, have a version of ESLint that is installed globally, but I have that for a different reason that we will cover when I talk about the integration with Visual Studio Code. Even VS Code will use the locally installed version of ESLint over the globally installed version of ESLint. So the first step is to install it. So npm install -- save ESLint. And we'll go ahead and give it a minute. Or maybe more time, or something. Stuff and things. I highly recommend everybody that runs a project does integrate ESLint into their project, which is why I'm covering it right here. So I went ahead and installed it globally, or locally, sorry. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute it against our project. Now, if you're not familiar with npm and the way the .bin folder works, I'll show you. However, I do cover this in more detail in the Using Modern JavaScript Today course. When you install a node package that comes with an executable or some sort of tool that you can run within your command line, it'll add that executable or tool or whatever into the node modules .bin folder. And as you see, we have both Unix and Windows bat files and binaries allowing us to, or not binaries, bash scripts that will execute that particular command. And if we look in this, we notice we have ESLint for the bash script, as well as ESLint.cmd for the Windows bat file. Which means I can come out here and have ESLint validate our code by simply typing in node modules /bin /ESLint space /source/. And by giving ESLint a directory, it'll actually go in and validate each of those files that it finds in that directory. Now, ESLint does require us to have a ESLint RC file that tells it how to be configured. You can override some configuration options within the command line itself, but instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an ESLint configuration file. So I'm going to right-click, create new file, and type in .ESLint rc.json. And ESLint.rc, or ESLint RC, will describe to ESLint our coding conventions, what we want ESLint to do, what we want it to ignore, and so on. So we're going to be filling out this file in this video so I can show you guys what each of those options mean and how you can then use those options to match your own coding style. So it is a JSON file, so we're going to open up an object, and I'm simply going to start off with the simplest thing. I'm going to say extends ESLint recommended. And what that does is that will inherit all of the rules from ESLint recommended into our ESLint configuration. So now I can come down here and I can rerun our ESLint, and I did not spell recommended right. Recommended. I can spell good. Okay, and then we get two errors. Parsing error, the keyword import is reserved and the keyword const is reserved. So on server.js, it's telling us, hey, this const keyword is reserved. See, the issue is that in previous versions of JavaScript, the const keyword was reserved even though it wasn't used. However, with the ES 2015, it is now a valid thing that we can use. So what we see here with ESLint is we haven't yet told it that we're going to be using ES 2015 features. Now, we can do this with the built-in ESLint parser, or do this by having Babel be our parser. So I'm going to start off by showing you guys how we would use the built-in ESLint parser, and then I'm going to show you guys how we would then integrate Babel into ESLint so that we can use features that are not available in the default ESLint parser, but are available in our Babel transpiler. I'll start off by doing env, by opening up env. The env option basically allows us to enable features and globals and stuff like that. Like if I say browser is true, what that means is ESLint will now consider things like window dot or document dot to be valid code. If you do not have browser set to true, things like window dot and document dot would throw an error saying window is not defined or document is not defined. Since we will be running client code, we definitely need to have access to those globals. Then, in the same light, I'm going to add in common.js and node. I'm going to set all those to true, and that will allow us to use the common.js globals and the node globals. In addition, you'll notice there's a bunch of these guys, things like jQuery or Jasmine, which we'll be using later, and so on. But the last one I want to do is add ES6. So I'm simply going to set ES6 to true. Now I'm going to come back here and rerun ESLint. Now notice that we have different errors. Our client is now complaining that import and export may only appear with source type equaling module. So let's go ahead and set that first. Let's fix that error. Outside of env, I'm going to go ahead and open up parser options. And inside of parser options, I'm going to set source type to module. Come back here, rerun ESLint. Now client no longer throws an error, but server still throws an error. Unexpected token ... If we come over here to server.js, that's because it doesn't understand the REST spread operator. But the default ESLint parser can understand the object REST spread operator by simply setting ECMA features experimental object REST spread to true. And by doing this, our code will now almost compile. Now, or not compile, almost validate. Now it's complaining that we are using the console. It says unexpected console statement, no console. No console is a rule that says that we can't use the console at all. We can't do console.log, and that's very useful for validating production builds, but for things like our testing purposes, we will be using console log a lot. So I am going to disable the no console rule here in a moment, but before I do that, I want to talk about the problem that we're going to face. So it looks like we are generally okay. And we can also enable JSX if we wanted to as well. We don't have any JSX code, but by enabling that, that will make it compile properly. But we have a problem, and that is, in a server.js, if I use class properties, if I say class app component, and I do static prop types equals object, blah is woe. If I do this, which is code that the ESLint parser is not going to understand, I now get a parsing error. See, these are rule errors, and if you get rule errors, it means that the whole file was properly parsed. This is a parsing error, which means the processing for that file was halted by ESLint because it couldn't parse the file. And that's because it doesn't understand prop types. Or not prop types, it doesn't understand static properties on the app component. That feature of JavaScript comes in from the transform class properties and syntax class properties Babel plugin. So now what we need to do is we need to tell ESLint to use Babel as its parser. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install a new package. I'm going to say npm install Babel-ESLint save. And the Babel-ESLint package is like a bridge between ESLint and Babel. So what I can do now is, instead of setting all these parser options, which are only used by, well, they are used by any parser, but these particular parser options are only understood by the default built-in parser in ESLint, I'm going to replace all of that with parser equals Babel-ESLint. Now, this parser property needs to match up with a module that's installed. But fortunately, we do have Babel-ESLint as a module that's installed already, because we just, well, installed it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to rerun ESLint. And now what we get is app component is not defined, never used, unexpected console statement, unexpected console statement. Now, they are errors that we are going to address here in a moment, but the important thing is we're not getting parsing errors anymore. ESLint now understands the new features of JavaScript that we are going to be using. I want to point out one thing, though. Although we did create the Babel-RC in the last video, the Babel-ESLint parser does not depend on the existence of the Babel-RC file. And you can see that if you read the source code. If I go into Babel-ESLint under node modules and open up index.js, we'll see the entirety of, or almost the entirety of the Babel-ESLint parser. All it does is it acts, like I said, like glue between ESLint and Babel. But you'll notice it has a list of built-in plugins that it will try to add, assuming that they are added to your project. So these are all the plugins that will be added to the Babel parser when it's used in the context of ESLint. And I can prove that the Babel-RC has no effect by coming into Babel-RC and just nuking all of this stuff. Coming back here and running ESLint source, I get the same output. So that proves that the Babel-RC is not being used by the Babel-ESLint. However, the Babel-RC will be being used by both WebPack and our Gulp file. So it's important that it still exists for other things, but it's not going to allow you to modify what the Babel-ESLint parser does and does not understand. The ESLint parser will simply understand whatever it by default understands, things like JSX or class properties and so on, as well as asynchronous functions. Assuming those plugins are installed in your node modules folder, they will be picked up and used by the Babel-ESLint parser. Alrighty, so now let's go ahead and set some rules. So I'm going to open up rules, and in rules, I'm going to go ahead and say indent. Oops. Now there's a bunch of rules. You can look at all these rules and basically modify your coding style to however you want. And you can go online, read the documentation about these different rules and what they do. We're going to see an example of a couple interesting rules here in this video. First thing is indent. So I'm going to set indent to basically the default, which will be air and tab. But I'm also going to pass in a special option into the indent rule and say switch case 1. See, if I didn't have switch case 1, let's come back to server, and I wrote a switch statement like this. Switch, let's do switch case 1, console log, hey, break, case 2, console log, whoa, break. And if I just left it like that, and I tried to validate, you will see, first of all, ignore the unexpected console statements and the not defined, but you will see a bunch of errors about the expected indentation of 0 tabs and 1 tab and so on and so on. The default ESLint rules want your switch statements to look like that. And I find that really ugly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to redefine the indentation rules to include a new option called switch case, and I'm going to set that to 1. What that'll do is that'll make this code now validate. If I come back over here and rerun, now the only errors that we get are about the console and the app component. And we'll be addressing those here in a moment. So also I'm going to be enforcing tabs, as you can see, and that is because tabs are far superior to spaces. And I know that people disagree. There's a big argument. You know, everyone has an opinion about tabs or spaces, blah, blah, blah. The only thing people agree on is not to mix them up, always be consistent, which ESLint will force you to do. I prefer tabs for very many reasons, and I really do not understand any argument that I've read that says we should use spaces instead. I just don't. I really tried, but I just don't. But it's up to you. You can use spaces if you want. I'm not going to be too upset. The next thing is another thing, is I'm going to set semi to error always. So this will enforce semicolons at the end of my lines. That's another thing that another debate in the JavaScript community, because semicolons are optional in JavaScript in many cases, but not all. And again, I don't understand the people who say not to use semicolons, especially when a lot of other languages, you know, C, C++, C#, Java, they force you to use semicolons, so people get in the habit of doing that, and they make your code more explicit, and I just prefer them. If you want to play around with not using semicolons, well then turn semi off. But That's up to you. Then I'm going to set no console to 0. And what that's going to do, well, either 0 or off. It doesn't matter. And what that's going to do is that's going to disable the no console rule. So now we're allowed to use the console. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and throw in some globals. Actually, I'm throwing one global, and that's going to be console, and I'm going to set that to false. And what that does is the globals makes it so I can access console as a global object, and it doesn't need to be defined or imported at all. The false means that I cannot reassign console to anything. So the false means that I cannot say console equals blah at any point. That will throw an error in ESLint because I set the ability to redefine it to false. However, I can have read-only access to console with setting that global. And with that, the only error we should now receive is app component not being used. So if I said console log app component, just app component, I guess, and which would then use the app component, now everything works. If I didn't have this console log app component, I'll get a no unused vars error. And no unused vars, it might be something that I end up disabling at some point in this course. I generally like it to be on, because if you have an unused variable anywhere in your code, that is going to be potentially a bug, problematic, something you forgot. It reduces the integrity of your code and makes your code more confusing. So I really like enforcing no unused vars a lot. And but sometimes when I'm just playing around with stuff and just throwing code at the wall and seeing what sticks, and then in that case, I would turn off that rule so that I don't have to worry about being, yelled at every single time. Or maybe I would turn it into a warning instead of an error so that it tells me that these things aren't used, but it doesn't stop it from stop WebPack from compiling. So now let's go ahead and do one more thing. So I'm going to do console log, and then I'm going to say app component, and I'm going to render it out like that. And let's see what ESLint has to say about that. So by referencing app component in JSX, ESLint is still complaining that app component is not used, which is going to be a problem because clearly it is being used. But ESLint doesn't understand JSX. Well, it does understand JSX, the syntax itself, but it doesn't understand that by using a component, we are referencing that. So we need to tell ESLint that we want this to be considered a usage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install a new package. I'm going to say npm install -- save. I'm going to pass in ESLint plugin -react. And the React plugin will hook into ESLint and say, okay, if a component is referenced, mark that as being a used variable. Then what I'm going to do is, I don't know where I'm going to put this. I'm going to put this next to extends. I'm going to open up plugins, and I'm just going to type in React. There's no reason to do ESLint -plugin -react. That is implied. So by doing that and rerunning it, you'll notice that we get the same error, and that is because we need to enable the rule that will allow this component to be referenced. So what I'm going to do here is in the rules, I'm going to do react/JSX uses React to error, and react/JSX uses vars to error. And then I come back here with those two rules enabled, rerunning my ESLint properly compiles. And that is how you configure ESLint. We will be coming back to the ESLint configuration as we start to need to tell ESLint about the different things that we're going to be using, but we will cover that as they come. Now, you'll notice that we still have a problem. On line 5, Visual Studio Code still does not understand the object REST spread, and that's because Visual Studio Code is currently not using our local, or is not configured to use our local ESLint installation. And in the next video, we will configure ESLint, or Visual Studio Code, to work with our local ESLint. And we'll see you guys then.